A president, blindfolded and bound, sits aboard a U.S. warship in the Caribbean. Hours earlier, American commandos breached his compound in a raid that killed dozens. Now, the man who ruled Venezuela for over a decade faces life in prison. How did a bus driver become a dictator? And what made the United States launch its most controversial military operation in years? The answers reveal a story of power, corruption, and a nation's collapse. This is the full story of the rise and fall of the man who turned one of South America's richest nations into a humanitarian catastrophe. Thanks for clicking on this video. We're just a group of friends with regular 9-to-5s, but these stories haunt us enough to spend our nights bringing them to you. We don't ask for much, just your subscription, a like, and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. Thank you for believing in what we're doing. Every single one of you makes this possible.
A boy stands at a bus stop in Caracas. It's 1979, and 17-year-old Nicolás Maduro watches his father head off to another union meeting. His dad, Nicolás Garcia, is a trade union leader who believes workers can change the world, and young Nicolás believed every word his father said. This moment plants a seed that will eventually reshape an entire nation's destiny. Nicolás Maduro Moros was born on November 23, 1962, in the gritty streets of Los Jardines, a working-class neighborhood in western Caracas. His mother, Teresa de Jesus Moros, came from Cúcuta, Colombia, right on the border. His father was that union leader, deeply involved in leftist politics. Nicolás grew up as the only boy among 4 siblings, with 3 sisters who watched him become increasingly passionate about politics and social justice. But here's what makes his childhood interesting. While other kids his age were focused on school, Maduro was drawn to something entirely different. He became president of his high school's student union at Liceo José Avalos. Teachers noticed his gift for public speaking, even though he never actually graduated from high school. Instead, he poured all his energy into organizing fellow students, learning how to rally people around a cause. He was also a huge fan of rock music, quoting John Lennon and dreaming about freedom. Some reports even say he turned down a contract offer from a Major League Baseball scout because politics had already captured his heart. At 24, Maduro's life took a turn that would define everything. In 1986, he traveled to Cuba for a full year of ideological training at a communist political school. This wasn't just a vacation or casual visit. Cuba's government ran these programs to create committed revolutionaries, and Maduro absorbed every lesson. When he returned to Venezuela, he wasn't the same person who left. He took a job as a bus driver for the Caracas metro system. Picture this: a young man with revolutionary ideas, driving a bus through the capital city, talking to working people every single day. He founded an unofficial trade union for metro workers, even though the company had banned unions at the time. This was risky. Management could have fired him, but Maduro pushed forward anyway, and he quickly earned a reputation as a focused organizer who could convince people to stand up for their rights. Then came 1992, the year everything changed. A young army officer named Hugo Chavez led a failed military coup against the government. Chavez ended up in prison, but his fiery speeches about fighting for Venezuela's poor had electrified the nation. Maduro saw something in Chavez that resonated with everything he'd learned in Cuba and from his father. He joined the movement to free Chavez from prison. That's also when he met Celia Flores, a young lawyer working on Chavez's defense. They fell in love while fighting for the same cause, and their partnership would become one of the most powerful political alliances in Venezuelan history. Chavez was released in 1994. 4 years later, in 1998, Chavez won the presidency, riding a wave of support from Venezuela's poor and working class. Maduro, the former bus driver, suddenly had a direct line to power. He helped Chavez rewrite the constitution in 1999, cementing radical changes to how Venezuela would be governed. In the year 2000, Maduro won a seat in the newly formed National Assembly, and his political career officially began. For the next several years, Maduro climbed the ranks. He became president of the National Assembly in 2005. Then Chavez appointed him foreign minister in 2006, a position he held for 6 years. As foreign minister, Maduro traveled the globe, building alliances with countries like Russia, China, Iran, and Cuba. He became Chavez's most trusted lieutenant, the man who would carry out the president's vision even when others doubted. Critics mocked him as lacking Chavez's charisma, calling him a buffoon who just repeated his mentor's talking points. But those critics underestimated his strategic thinking and his absolute loyalty. October 2012 brought devastating news. Chavez announced he needed another cancer surgery and named Maduro as his vice president. Everyone understood what this meant. Chavez was preparing Maduro to take over. On March 5, 2013, Hugo Chavez died, and Nicolás Maduro became interim president. The entire nation mourned Chavez, whose larger-than-life personality had dominated Venezuelan politics for 14 years. If you're still watching and learning how a bus driver became a president, do me a favor. Like this video, share it with someone who needs to understand what's happening in Venezuela, and drop a comment with your thoughts. Your engagement helps us bring more stories like this. A special election was called for in April 2013. Maduro ran as Chavez's chosen heir, promising to continue the socialist revolution. His opponent, Enrique Capriles, represented the opposition. The race was incredibly close. When the results came in, Maduro had won by just 1.5% of the vote. Capriles refused to accept the results, demanding a recount and claiming fraud. The opposition believed Maduro had stolen the election, but he was sworn in as president on April 19, 2013, regardless. That's when Venezuela's nightmare truly began. Maduro inherited an economy already in trouble. Chavez had relied on high oil prices to fund massive social programs, but he never diversified the economy or saved money for harder times. When oil prices collapsed in 2014, Venezuela's government faced a crisis. Instead of cutting spending or implementing reforms, Maduro chose the worst possible solution. He ordered the central bank to print more money. The inflation that followed was catastrophic. By 2016, Venezuela's inflation rate hit 800%, the highest in the world. But that was just the beginning. By 2018, annual inflation reached 1,300,000%. Let that sink in. Prices doubled every 19 days. People's life savings evaporated overnight. A salary that could buy groceries for a month suddenly couldn't buy a loaf of bread. Venezuelans started measuring prices in US dollars because their own currency, the bolivar, had become worthless paper. The economy contracted by more than 50% between 2013 and 2018. This was worse than America's Great Depression. It was worse than most countries that had experienced actual wars. More than 7.7 million Venezuelans, nearly a quarter of the population, fled the country on foot, walking to Colombia, Peru, Chile, and beyond. They left behind homes, careers, and families because staying meant starvation. Supermarkets had empty shelves, hospitals ran out of medicine and basic supplies. Doctors performed surgeries without anesthesia. Mothers watched their children waste away from malnutrition. Diseases that had been eradicated for decades, like malaria and diphtheria, came roaring back. The national power grid collapsed repeatedly, leaving major cities without electricity for days. In Caracas, the capital, running water became a luxury. Crime exploded as desperate people fought for survival. And how did Maduro respond? By tightening his grip on power and crushing dissent. In 2014, massive protests erupted across Venezuela. People took to the streets demanding change. Maduro's security forces responded with tear gas, rubber bullets, and live ammunition. 43 people died in those protests, and dozens were arrested. The opposition won control of the National Assembly in 2015, the first time in 16 years they'd controlled any branch of government. This should have forced Maduro to compromise. Instead, he packed the Supreme Court with his own loyalists. These judges then stripped power from the assembly, effectively making it meaningless. When international observers called this a dictatorship, Maduro didn't even deny it. He called his opponents fascists and terrorists. In 2017, things got worse. Maduro created a new legislative body called the Constituent Assembly, stacked entirely with his supporters. This body had the power to override everything, including the actual elected assembly. Massive protests followed. For months, Venezuelans flooded the streets. Security forces didn't just disperse crowds, they hunted protesters. More than 100 people died. Over 1,200 were injured. Maduro called it defending democracy. Behind the scenes, reports emerged of systematic torture. The Venezuelan intelligence service, known as DGCIM, ran what human rights groups called Operation Knock Knock. Agents went door to door, arresting anyone suspected of opposing the government. Many were never charged with crimes. They simply disappeared into prisons, where, according to multiple testimonies, they were beaten, starved, and sexually assaulted. Amnesty International released a damning report in 2018, accusing Maduro's government of committing some of the worst human rights violations in Venezuela's history. Between 2015 and 2017 alone, security forces carried out 8,292 extrajudicial executions, most of them in poor neighborhoods. 22% of all homicides in 1 year were committed by police and military forces. These weren't accidents or mistakes. This was state-sponsored violence designed to terrorize the population into submission. Maduro held another presidential election in 2018. By this point, he had banned most opposition candidates from running. The election was widely condemned as fraudulent. When Maduro declared victory, nearly 60 countries, including the United States, refused to recognize him as legitimate president. They instead recognized Juan Guaidó, the head of the National Assembly, as Venezuela's interim president. But Guaidó had no real power, and Maduro controlled the military and security forces. The standoff continued for years. Meanwhile, the United States government was building a criminal case. In March 2020, U.S. prosecutors unsealed an indictment charging Maduro with narco-terrorism. The indictment alleged something shocking: that Maduro and his inner circle ran what they called the Cartel of the Suns, a massive drug trafficking organization. According to prosecutors, Maduro had coordinated with the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, known as FARC, to move tons of cocaine into the United States. The indictment claimed he provided military-grade weapons to drug traffickers, negotiated multi-ton coke shipments, and used Venezuela's diplomatic infrastructure to smuggle drugs. The U.S. government offered a $15 million reward for information leading to his arrest. Maduro laughed it off. He called the charges American imperialism and propaganda, but the accusations kept coming, and the evidence kept mounting. In January 2025, the U.S. government increased the reward to $25 million. By August 2025, after designating the Cartel of the Suns as a terrorist organization, they raised it to $50 million. Maduro had become the most wanted man in U.S. law enforcement history, with the highest bounty ever offered. But Maduro still believed he was untouchable. In July 2024, he held another election. The opposition united behind Edmundo González Urrutia, a relatively unknown diplomat. Maria Corina Machado, the opposition's most popular leader, had been banned from running, so she threw her support behind González. Polls showed González would win easily, but everyone worried about fraud. On July 28, 2024, millions of Venezuelans voted. Opposition poll watchers collected official tally sheets from over 80% of voting centers across the country. These sheets, which are supposed to be public by law, showed González winning in a landslide, with 67% of the vote compared to Maduro's 30%. It wasn't even close. But just after midnight, Venezuela's National Electoral Council made an announcement. They claimed Maduro had won with 51%. They provided no evidence, no breakdown by polling station, no tally sheets, just a simple declaration. The Carter Center, the only international observer organization present, immediately called it fraudulent. Statistical analysis by multiple independent experts confirmed that the opposition's numbers were accurate and that a Maduro victory was statistically impossible. Venezuelans exploded with rage. Hundreds of thousands took to the streets. In some cities, protesters toppled statues of Hugo Chavez. Maduro's response was swift and brutal. Security forces arrested more than 2,000 people in the days after the election. 25 people were killed in the crackdown. Maduro announced he would send arrested protesters to maximum security prisons with minimum 15-year sentences. He even created a smartphone app called VenApp, where citizens could report their neighbors for protesting. The international community condemned the fraud. The United States, European Union, and most Latin American countries refused to recognize Maduro's victory. But Russia, China, Iran, and a handful of other authoritarian regimes congratulated him. In January 2025, despite worldwide condemnation, Maduro held an inauguration ceremony. He stood before supporters and declared himself president for a third term, comparing himself to the biblical David fighting Goliath. He claimed his power came from the people, not from foreign governments. Gonzalez had fled to exile in Spain by this point, fearing for his life. Donald Trump had just returned to the White House for his second term in January 2025. Unlike his predecessor, Trump took an aggressive stance toward Maduro. In November 2025, Trump called Maduro directly. According to officials present, Trump gave Maduro an ultimatum: step down and leave Venezuela, or face the consequences. Maduro refused. Trump imposed a 25% tariff on Venezuelan goods, doubled the bounty on Maduro's head, and sanctioned his family members. The U.S. Navy began conducting operations in the Caribbean, striking vessels that allegedly carried Venezuelan drugs. In December 2025, the Coast Guard started seizing oil tankers carrying Venezuelan crude. A blockade was forming. Maduro responded with defiant speeches, calling Trump a fascist and vowing never to surrender. You're watching history unfold in real time. If this story is keeping you on the edge of your seat, like this video, comment your predictions for what happens, and subscribe because the ending is something no one saw coming. Behind the scenes, the CIA had been operating inside Venezuela for months. Intelligence officers tracked Maduro's every movement, noting where he lived, where he traveled, what he ate, who he met. They studied the layout of his compound in Caracas. U.S. military planners built an exact replica of Maduro's house and spent weeks rehearsing an extraction operation. They called it Operation Absolute Resolve, and it involved over 150 aircraft, including fighters, bombers, helicopters, and surveillance planes. The mission was ready by early December 2025, but they waited for the right moment. On the night of January 2nd, 2026, weather conditions finally cleared. At 11:46 p.m. local time, President Trump gave the green light. At 2 a.m. on January 3rd, explosions rocked Caracas. American bombers hit military installations across northern Venezuela, destroying air defense systems and command centers. While those strikes created chaos, Delta Force operators flew in on helicopters, skimming just 100 feet above the Caribbean Sea to avoid detection. They touched down at Maduro's fortified compound at 2:01 a.m. According to Joint Chiefs Chairman General Dan Kane, Maduro and his wife both tried to reach a safe room, but operators breached the compound too quickly. Within minutes, Nicolás Maduro and Celia Flores were in American custody. Neither was harmed during the operation, though Flores sustained injuries, possibly including broken ribs and facial bruising. By 3:39 a.m., the extraction team was back over water with their prisoners. By 4:29 a.m., Maduro was aboard the USS Iwo Jima. President Trump posted a photo on social media showing Maduro blindfolded and wearing a gray tracksuit. By 4:30 p.m. that same day, Maduro and his wife had landed at Stewart Air National Guard Base in upstate New York. The world reacted with shock. Some countries, particularly in Latin America, celebrated. Venezuelan exiles wept with joy. But many world leaders condemned the operation as a violation of international law and Venezuelan sovereignty. The United Nations called it a dangerous precedent. Critics argued that the United States had essentially kidnapped a foreign head of state without any legal authority. Trump defended the operation in a press conference at his Mar-a-Lago resort. He claimed it was one of the greatest military operations in American history, comparing the speed and precision to watching a television show. He said the U.S. would run Venezuela temporarily until a proper transition could be arranged, though Secretary of State Marco Rubio later walked back those claims, saying the U.S. wouldn't govern Venezuela day to day. Trump also made clear that access to Venezuela's vast oil reserves was a major factor in the operation. Back in Venezuela, Vice President Delcy Rodriguez demanded proof of life for Maduro and his wife. She claimed not to know where they were. Within days, the Venezuelan Supreme Court declared Rodriguez the acting president. The Maduro government remained in place, but its leader was gone. On Monday, January 5, 2026, Nicolás Maduro appeared in federal court in Manhattan. He was escorted by DEA agents and led into the courtroom in handcuffs. When Judge Alvin Hellerstein asked for his identity, Maduro introduced himself as the president of Venezuela and a prisoner of war. His wife, wearing a bandage on her forehead and showing visible injuries, identified herself as the First Lady. The indictment charged Maduro with narco-terrorism conspiracy, cocaine importation conspiracy, weapons charges, and more. If convicted, he faces life in prison. His wife faces similar charges, including allegations that she accepted hundreds of thousands of dollars in bribes related to drug trafficking operations. Maduro's attorney, Barry Pollock, who previously represented WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange, signaled they would challenge the legality of his arrest. He argued that Maduro, as a head of state, has sovereign immunity, and that his military abduction was illegal. When asked for his plea, Maduro was defiant. "I am innocent. I am not guilty of anything mentioned here," he said through an interpreter. "I am a decent man. Still president of my country." Celia Flores pleaded not guilty as well. "Completely innocent," she said. Both were ordered to remain in custody at the Metropolitan Detention Center in Brooklyn. The judge set their next court appearance for March 17, 2026. Legal experts predict the case could drag on for years, with Maduro's defense team filing numerous motions challenging everything from jurisdiction to the circumstances of his capture. If you've made it this far, you're officially invested in this story. Show your support by hitting that like button. Drop a comment with your final thoughts, and subscribe so you never miss another deep dive like this one. Your engagement keeps these stories coming. The implications of Maduro's capture are enormous. More than 80 people were reportedly killed during the U.S. military operation, including 32 Cuban military personnel who were in Venezuela supporting Maduro's regime. The Venezuelan people are left in limbo, uncertain about their future. Maria Corina Machado, the opposition leader who won the Nobel Peace Prize in 2025 for her fight against Maduro's dictatorship, praised the operation, but noted she hadn't been consulted by the Trump administration. Trump has hinted at similar operations against other countries he views as threats, mentioning Colombia and suggesting he might take military action there as well. Critics warn this sets a dangerous precedent, that the United States can unilaterally invade sovereign nations and capture their leaders whenever it wants, without international approval or legal process. For Nicolás Maduro, the boy who grew up in a working-class neighborhood watching his father fight for workers' rights, the fall is complete. He went from bus driver to union leader to president, but his legacy is one of suffering, corruption, and catastrophe. Under his rule, Venezuela transformed from one of Latin America's wealthiest nations into a humanitarian disaster zone. Millions fled. Thousands died. An entire generation lost hope. His court case will test fundamental questions about international law, sovereignty, and justice. Can a former head of state be prosecuted for crimes committed while in office? Does the United States have the right to enforce its laws on foreign soil against foreign leaders? And ultimately, will Nicolás Maduro spend the rest of his life in an American prison, or will legal challenges eventually set him free? The only certainty is that the story of Nicolás Maduro represents a cautionary tale about unchecked power, failed ideology, and the human cost of authoritarianism. From the streets of Caracas to a federal courtroom in New York, his journey shows how one person's decisions can destroy millions of lives. And now, sitting in a Brooklyn jail cell, the man who once called himself president must face the consequences of his choices.